Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Barry Lyndon. This film came out in 1975 and it was written and directed by Stanley Kubrick. This is one of my all-time favorite Kubrick films. It's like when I'd put, 2001's my favorite and I would put Barry Lyndon right underneath it. But what's ironic about it is that nobody knows what this movie is. Even people that consider themselves fans of Stanley Kubrick. I mention this movie and they're just kind of like, what? I consider this film to be his forgotten masterpiece. It came out after A Clockwork Orange, and I think maybe that might be one of the reasons why this film didn't get quite the notoriety, because Clockwork Orange obviously for its time was extremely controversial, very shocking piece. And Barry Lyndon just isn't bombastic in that way. It's a much more subtle piece. And I know that when the film came out, it was like mixed reviews, a lot of mixed reception. It definitely was not successful, especially compared to all of his earlier works. A lot of people, especially American audiences, found it to be boring, meandering. And then, of course, European audiences found it to be this, this beautiful, this sumptuous work of art. And that is the difference between Americans and Europeans. For me, this is not a period piece in that, traditional sense. It's a film that takes place in a certain period, and it's an examination of the human condition and how it is shaped by this particular society. This society being the 18th century in Europe. This movie is quite a long one, and it is set in two parts. The first part is about Raymond Barry, who's played by Ryan O'Neal, and he's an Irishman. He is a person who is very driven by his passion for adventure, doing things on his own terms. And he does a lot of things in the first half. He travels all over Europe fighting in the 7 Years' War, and he eventually climbs the way up the ladder of success to wealth and privilege. He marries into a very rich family, and he receives the title Barry Lyndon, and that's where the second part comes in. And the second part is kind of basically all the tragedies that befall Barry as he loses his status, his wealth, one of his very important appendages, basically everything. I've said this in quite a few other reviews that I've done about Stanley Kubrick, but one of the big criticisms of him is that he is often considered a very cold director, somebody that examines the human condition kind of from a distance. He's very calculated, and he doesn't really create those emotional dynamics like a lot of other film directors do. And I think that that is a valid criticism to a certain extent, but I think that it really works to the film's advantage here. This is a movie that is making a statement about the era in which it takes place. It's about that contradiction between status and high society with, this brutality. And that no matter who you are, where you come from, no matter what society you've been shaped by, we all kind of revert to the same instincts because we are animals, like the apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I think this movie goes about achieving that theme in a lot of really clever ways. I think, first of all, not only is this a commentary on the period, but it also has a lot of hints of satire. And, I think that that's one thing that gets neglected is kind of, this movie's quite humorous, as are many of Kubrick films. And this comes out especially in the aristocracy, the mannerisms of the characters and when they're put in certain situations. One of the things I love that I think is most funny about the film is the narrator. And in the book, because this is based on a book, the narrator is Barry Lyndon himself. But the film version has an omniscient narrator. And that makes it very distant, and he has this very cold delivery. It's almost like he's narrating like a documentary on the History Channel. And it makes it feel like the account of a life that has no connection to our world, has no connection to you or to me. It's a moment in time that serves as a point of reference for how so many people go about living their lives, and it kind of transcends that time period. No matter what era we're in, we're all people and we do so many of the same things. When part one of the film ends, the narrator is talking, but as the screen goes to black, he keeps talking and they just cut him off. It's as if to say that the narration, what he's saying, is not necessarily relevant. It's kind of how the narration is setting a tone. It serves as that kind of metaphor, almost like we are examining the human experience. We're examining humans as if they're specimens in some sort of scientific experiment. And that's an important point as well, I think. So much of what we see in the Lyndon character in particular is never on the surface. It's all just dealt with an implication. Yes, there is a narrator telling you basically what's happening in a very factual sense, but in terms of what motivates the character, so much of that is what you kind of have to decide for yourself. depending on certain mannerisms and so many of the decisions that Barry makes that eventually kind of are mirrored in the second half. There's so much mirroring from part 1 to part 2. So many similar situations take place in the second half, but just in very different circumstances. And not all of them are caused by Barry's actions, but, you know, just kind of depending on what he's come across in other characters. Anything from like the opening duel at the very beginning of the film, there's a duel at the end of the film, a lot of the love, like the relationships that Barry has with women in the beginning of the film and then the end of the film. But for me, the most important reoccurring theme is that the theme of the father figures in Barry's life and how Barry becomes a father to his son in the second half, and also to his stepson, Lord Bullingdon. The theme of what people pass down from generation to generation is something that is also a recurring theme in films like The Shining. You see how Barry was affected by these recurring father figures in his life and how so much of Barry's faults as well as his strengths are echoed in his own son, Brian. But Barry's faults, as much as they echo in other characters, tend to get the better of him, and that's kind of why he loses everything in his life's quest. Barry is a person who oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes he does things for his own benefit, not for anybody else's. He did things to help himself get where he wanted to be. And I think by doing that, he loses so much of that dignity. He loses what made him so strong, so driven in the first place. He's a very hot-headed person, driven by gut instinct and driven by, as I said before, like love, passion, but he's also very angry and he has a need to kind of dominate. And while that kind of gutsy personality that he has definitely carried him very far, allowed him to, you know, see all kinds of different sights and have so many different experiences that he might not have had he been a different type of person. But in the end, what he thinks he wants, what so many people want, just kind of end up making him stagnant. As he gets older and starts to settle down and feel comfortable, he loses that individuality by giving into that kind of comfort of society. And you'll notice, I think at least, there is a difference between the way that Barry is shot in the first half and the second half in terms of the cinematography. When you look at the second half, he's always kind of part of a much bigger picture, a huge background that makes the scene look like an 18th century painting. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. When I was a kid, I just looked at those images and I would just pause them and just marvel at how stunning they were. But the older that I get, the more that I realize there's actually, at least from my point of view, there's real symbolism in that look, of that painting look. It fits with the theme that so many of these characters are a product of their era. They are frozen in time forever, just kind of like a nick in a timeline, and they are often unable to make an impact in the ways that they really do desire. And as I said, particularly with the zoom lenses that really flatten those spaces out and make them look like paintings, it almost makes it seem almost claustrophobic. Maybe not in the sense that we are thinking, but for Barry himself, he's such a small part of a bigger picture, no pun intended. But there is one image in the film that moved me so much when I was watching it, and it never really, I mean, it always to me was very striking, but it never affected me quite like it did when I watched the film this most recently. And it's the image of Barry and his son, his little boy, and, you know, they're reading a story together, and then, you know, it's a close-up of the two of them. And then you have the next shot is a long shot, and in the shot you see Barry and his son just right in the corner of the frame, but there's this gigantic painting over them, like they're just kind of hanging over the top. And that image was, I mean, it was just breathtaking. I almost kind of got choked up watching it, and that's not something that I've ever really felt watching this film. It made me sad. It was a very kind of existential realization for me. This man, you know, Barry, is trying to continue his legacy. He's confronting his own mortality by, you know, having this son and trying to pass on his knowledge to him. But in the great scheme of things, it doesn't really count for much. Number one, because a lot of Barry's decisions end up kind of coming back to bite him in the ass later on, but also because of, you know, the tragedy that does eventually befall his own son very soon after, and also just the idea that existence is fleeting, and, you know, this character who's wanting so badly to kind of make an impression like we all do, in the end is just kind of part of just a society, part of something that is frozen in time, like the painting. You look at the painting, who knows who those people are or what their true story was? We'll probably never know. And it's kind of going to be the same for his story and my story and your story. Hate to be sad about it, but it's true. And there are so many beautiful, beautiful, beautiful images in this movie. It is, I mean, ridiculous. The natural lighting in it is so, so gorgeous, and that's part of what gives it that realism, that natural feel. This movie is a cinephile's wet dream. It really is, because, you know, like I look at the scene, especially the wordless scenes, the scene where Barry first encounters Lady Lyndon, and it's that, you know, with that beautiful piano trio piece of music and the lighting, and there's no words, and it's just poetry watching the two of them. And then there's of course the duel scene, the scene towards the end of the film that is very, very famous, probably the most famous one in the film, for good reason, I would say. It is just the perfect exercise in what it means to kind of unravel tension so perfectly, and it is, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. It's one of the best scenes I've ever seen in anything. And I can see why this movie may not be, you know, as entertaining, as commercially resonant with people like, you know, other movies that Stanley Kubrick has done, like The Shining and A Clockwork Orange and Spartacus and Full Metal Jacket and so many others. But this film, again, is a more subtle experience, and it does, I think, impact you in ways that you're not really gonna understand after you just walk out of the theater or, you know, just finish watching it. It's something that settles in you, and it's kind of one of those sensory experiences that you'll never forget. Like, you know there's something really powerful and deep going on. You're just not quite sure how to maybe express it until you've seen it multiple times. It's shaped by implication. It's shaped by behavior that is not on the surface. It is shaped by the visual imagery. And I think it's one of those things that I encourage all people, not just Kubrick fans, but just movie fans, to witness. And I want this movie to finally get the recognition it deserves. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below, and you can also like my Facebook page and the link below that. Catch you next time.